This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm going to turn the panel over to one of the great architects of interdisciplinary and religious conversation on this campus, Dean Bobby Paul. Bobby is a chair of the anthropology department, pluralized that department and made it much richer and opened it up into conversation with a variety of different disciplines and schools of thought on the campus. He then was an architect of the Institute for Liberal Arts, which is one of our shining examples of true interdisciplinary study. He then became Dean of Emory College, and in that capacity opened a number of new channels of discourse across traditional silos, and was particularly instrumental in building up Buddhist studies on the campus and building up the Emory-Tibet Exchange. And so it's particularly apt that Dean Paul is the person who introduces this final panel on the pursuit of happiness in Buddhist perspective. Will you join me in giving a round of applause to Bobby Paul?
Thank you very much, John. It's a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be addressing you and to introduce Matthieu Ricard. I've also been asked to just say a couple of minutes to contextualize this afternoon's event, and so I will just make a couple of very brief comments. One of them is that Buddhism, like every other major religion, is not a unified belief system. There are many trends within it, far too many for me to begin to even outline what some of them are. But the Tibetan tradition to which the Dalai Lama belongs and with which Emory is therefore affiliated is one that's in the Mahayana tradition whose great addition to the study of Buddhism was an emphasis on compassion. So that the idea of cultivating compassion, that compassion is something that can be taught, that can be learned, that can be cultivated, that can be developed, is something that is particularly appropriate in this school of thought. So when listening to Dr. Ricard, you will understand that he has been steeped in a school of thought that brought to the Buddhist tradition a particular emphasis on the importance of compassion. Buddhism has always been concerned about, as all the other great religions are, with the care and salvation of the individual person. But the emphasis on developing the capacity for compassion is something that I think is particular to the Mahayana school. And especially to the Tibetan branch of it. So I think I would like to emphasize that. And that makes it particularly appropriate, I think, that Corey Keyes is going to speak about this, because he represents a new wave within contemporary scholarship that emphasizes the fact that happiness is not simply the absence of something, but it is a positive thing in itself that can be nurtured, developed, and cultivated in much the same way. That is, that there's a parallel here, whereas sometimes, and this is, I admit, an oversimplification, that Buddhism can be seen as a via negativa, that is, as a removal of obstacles to simply leave what's left over. The notion of happiness as something that is just the absence of sorrow or the absence of pain is an idea that is being contested now with the notion that there really is something to happiness as a substantive something, just as there is to compassion, and they're closely related, that can be developed. So I think it's very important that Corey will be speaking about this. And then the other thing I want to mention that puts this in context, that is related to the presence of Professor Perry, and the fact that this is taking place in a law school, indeed, has to do with the institutionalization and the contextualization. As the logo for this conference says, our own Declaration of Independence places the pursuit of happiness at the center of American life. And the question of what is happiness and what is the pursuit of it, of course, is crucial, but also the question of what role does the state play, what role does government play, what role does law play, what role do institutions play in promoting or enabling or mandating or commanding happiness. And in that respect, I would just mention that the Mahayana tradition that Tibet represents, with all its faults, and we can all admit that Tibet in its traditional days had many flaws as a society, but it did, when it collected taxes, didn't put them into nuclear weapons. It put them mainly into the support of a monastic system, the point of which was to develop compassion, and through compassion, widespread happiness. Whether it achieved that or not is another question, but even the sheer fact that you would have a government that would collect your taxes in order to make people happy is something that I think we should give serious thought to, and it's not by accident that the one Buddhist country that exists as an independent nation today, Bhutan, that is ruled by a Tibetan Buddhist king, and has a majority population of Tibetan Buddhists, which, footnote, has led to severe ethnic strife there, so that Bhutan itself is far from an exemplary picture of the ideal society. But nonetheless, it is the one country that, instead of basing its notion of progress and success on the gross national product, has based it on gross national happiness. And the idea being, of course, what is the state of the affairs of its citizens? Are they well cared for? Do they have medical attention when they need it? Do they have adequate facilities for just to live and to carry on their work? The notion of placing happiness as the goal of society rather than, say, profit, gives us another alternative, and this comes from the Buddhist tradition. So I'm very curious to hear also about the question of how does happiness relate to the state and to the government and to its laws. So having placed that in context, I would like to now introduce our main speaker today, who is Matthieu Ricard, who has lived in the Himalayan region for 40 years. He was born in France and obtained his PhD degree in cell genetics at the Institut Pasteur under the great François Jacob, the Nobel laureate. But instead of going on to an academic career, he entered a monastic career and has lived in India, Bhutan, and Nepal, studying with some of the greatest living teachers of that tradition, including Kangyo Rinpoche and the Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and as I just learned from the Trulshik Rinpoche, who I also knew when we happened to both be in the region in the 1960s. So I feel a kinship there. He's the author of many books, including, I think, the best known, The Monk and the Philosopher, a dialogue with his father, the French philosopher Jean-François Ravel, which has been translated into 21 languages. In addition, The Quantum and the Lotus, a dialogue with the astrophysicist Trinh Xuan Tuan, Happiness, a guide to developing life's most important skills, and Why Meditate. He's also a renowned photographer, and for many decades has been photographing the spiritual masters, landscapes, and people of the Himalayas. He's the author in photography of Journey to Enlightenment, Tibet, An Inner Journey, Buddhist Himalaya, Motionless Journey, and Bhutan, Land of Peace. He's a member of the Mind and Life Institute, an organization dedicated to collaborative research between scientists and Buddhist scholars and meditators, and he's engaged in the research on the effect of mind training and meditation on the brain at various institutions throughout the USA and Europe. He now lives in Shechen Monastery in Nepal, and I should add that he donates all proceeds from his books and much of his time to 40 humanitarian projects, including clinics, schools, orphanages, elderly people's homes, bridges, vocational trainings throughout Asia. He received the French National Order of Merit for his humanitarian works, and so it was with great pleasure that I introduce to you Matthieu Ricard.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to discover our past connection. And I'm very impatient to hear both of you, but I'm told I have to say something to start with. And so And also I was told instead of 15 minutes, it might be more like 50 minutes. So it's not fine. I hope we won't get too overdose with happiness. So yes, it's, I will start with the French and Parisian intellectuals. They hate happiness. So that's why I ended up having to write a book. Because this wonderful book of His Holiness, The Art of Happiness, which was a bestseller in France despite having no reviews at all, was trashed down by a few intellectuals. They say that's so silly to say that the goal of life is happiness. And so then I started to respond a little bit, and I thought, well, this is a nice subject. And maybe we should explore that, because how can it be that the other guy is a brilliant intellectual, a very good writer, much better than me, and then His Holiness, of course, is such an extraordinary mind. So how can two great minds have totally different, totally opposite views on happiness? There's something basic misunderstanding. So when I wrote this little book, in the beginning it was sort of a reply, and then I thought the polemical aspect would not be so interesting, so I went more in details. But I did address some of the issue raised, and then I hope that this person would reply in a positive way. But then he wrote a review. It was only in France you can have a national debate on does happiness exist or not. It was huge posters, the two big magazines. And then he wrote a reply called The Dirty Works of Happiness. Stop bugging us that we must be happy. We are so unhappy, and that's how we are, and we love it, and so forth. So anyway, but that makes you understand that, and then the thing you hear often is there cannot be a definition of happiness, because there's so many ways to achieve happiness exactly the way you find your own happiness, so there cannot be, there will not be, it's impossible. Well, I think it needs to be examined. It is quite true that if you look throughout the history of ideas, you could make two columns and find every definition and find just the opposite. Happiness is only in the present moment, and someone else wrote, oh no, it's not just, it's only about evoking nice memories of the past, imagining the future, and so forth and so forth. And then Bergson, the French philosopher, summarized that by saying that all the great thinkers of humanity have left the definition of happiness in the vague so that everyone could define in their own terms. Well, if, as His Holiness Dalai Lama says, and Aristotle said, happiness is the goal of goals, that means everything else is in order to achieve fulfillment, well-being, sense of flourishing, but that itself is a fully, sort of is a goal in itself, then if we leave it in the vague, then it's a bit troublesome, because if it's just a secondary thing in life, you could leave it in the vague. But if it's the goal of goals, and if you don't know at all what it is, and then it's like shooting arrows with blindfold in the dark. Sometimes you hit the target, but you don't even know why. So then you speak of magic moments of grace, fleeting moment of happiness, and you don't know why it happened, why it's not remaining with you. So it seems that it is worthwhile to try to little bit investigate, because even those magic moments, if someone says walking in the snow under the stars, what a magic moment. But if you think about it, those magic moments have some characteristics, some qualities. You could look within and say, well, that was a moment where all the inner conflicts were sort of suspended or vanished. I felt in harmony with nature, with myself, with others. So those are qualities that you might think about. And maybe they don't have to be just magic. Maybe they could be cultivated as skills. So it would seem that to better understand the inner workings of the mechanism of happiness and suffering will be helpful if it's the goal of goals. And especially because, at least according to the Buddhist view, we all yearn for happiness. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day and if possible my whole life. And whether we say like we are not interested in happiness like French intellectuals and write a book against it, even that in a way is not to make himself and others suffer. That person thinks that is bringing something better for society, for clarification of ideas, so it's making a useful contribution. And if you say that no, happiness doesn't matter, but there are many other things more important, like creativity, like the pursuit of justice, and so forth, well, you might say that's the way you find your own flourishing and fulfilling. So then, but Buddhist teaching said, yes, we all yearn for big freedom from suffering, but it seems that we are running toward it. We all would like to achieve happiness, but it seems that we're turning our back to it. So mental confusion, in a way, is what prevents us from achieving this flourishing. Basic ignorance, which is not simply a lack of information, like not knowing the telephone directory by heart, but a misconstruing reality, a fundamental lack of adequation with reality, being at odds with reality, will cause a lot of dysfunctioning that brings suffering. So then it may be useful to see what are the common confusion between happiness and other states of mind. So one of the most common one, of course, is to say, oh, happiness will be an endless succession of pleasurable feelings or sensation of experiences. That sounds more like a recipe for exhaustion than happiness. But there's a reason for that. And if you look at the components of a pleasurable sensation, it is highly dependent on time, circumstances, places. In a way, it's highly vulnerable to the change of the outer condition. And it is also something that is fleeting and changing in nature. It can be very pleasant a moment, then neutral and aversive. If you take a hot shower after a walk in a cold morning, winter morning in the forest, it's like bliss. But if you had to stay 24 hours under this hot shower, it would not be so wonderful. If you hear the most beautiful piece of Bach, and if your favorite music, you might decide to hear it 3 times. But if it's, again, 24 hours, the same one in your ears, it becomes... So it has a tendency to exhaust itself like a candle. It's also something that that doesn't radiate outwardly. You might feel a strong, pleasurable sensation where everyone is in great suffering around you and not care for it. So there's no sort of glow about just feeling a pleasant sensation. So now, if we look at happiness in the way that the Buddhism defines it, it defines it not as a mere feeling. It defines it as a way of being. And a way of being that is not just wanting, but the result of coming together of a cluster of certain human qualities. And then if you can try to investigate them, but basically they are quite dominant ones, like altruistic love, compassion, sense of inner peace and inner confidence, inner freedom from compulsive thoughts, from hatred, from mental toxins that undermine happiness. So all those together, if you compare that with pleasure, then you can see that might be influences, of course, by the outer conditions, but basically it's not dependent on them. And it is something that the more you experience it, the more it deepens, both your understanding of it and your familiarization with it. So it becomes deeper and more stable. Instead of being highly vulnerable to outer conditions, it gives you the resources to deal with those outer conditions and with the ups and downs of mind, of life. So in a way, we could say that it is an exceptionally healthy state of mind that perdures through all kinds of emotions and give you the resources to deal with whatever comes your way. So in that sense, paradoxically, it might even be that it remains even in what we normally will call an unpleasant sensation, like sadness. If genuine happiness is made of the coming together and the blossoming of compassion, love, inner strength, inner freedom, and so forth, if something is very sad, you might still be filled with compassion. You might still retain the sense of direction in life, sense of meaning, sense of purpose. You might be retain your inner freedom in the sense that you are not so overwhelmed that from sadness you just collapse into despair. The sense of the quality of remaining alive and sense of that there's a sense of fulfillment to come in life can remain. So even it's in the face of a very tragic event, the sadness can be. It doesn't need to destroy happiness, although certainly it will be incompatible with what we call a pleasant state of mind. So in that sense, then we can also see that all those qualities can be considered as skills. That means we have them to a certain extent, but maybe that potential is, I mean, we cannot ascribe numbers, but imagine like 10% of your capacity for altruism, 10% of your capacity to deal with afflictive emotions. So there's an incredible faculty or potential for making that to flourish. So another usual confusion is to instinctively put all our hopes and fears outside ourselves. We have this idea that if I had all that, definitely I'll be happy. And then we hear of people who precisely have everything to be happy. They are all the outer conditions seems to be perfect. They have as much wealth as they would want. They are maybe powerful and successful and famous. And on top of that, they might be a beautiful physical appearance that everyone admires. And then one day you hear, this guy is going to a deep depression. And you think, what's wrong with this guy? If I had all that, of course I'll be happy. But it simply shows that it's something else. We know that however important outer conditions can be, and this not to neglect them. We all want to live in suitable conditions, in freedom, have access to education, be in good health, and have long life and harmonious relations with others. And of course, when it's not, those conditions are lacking in this world, we should do everything that we can to remedy to poverty, famine, and other adverse conditions, and wars and conflicts. Yet, intrinsically, we know that the way we translate the outer condition into inner experience can easily override those outer conditions. We know of people who are totally depressed in a little paradise, and others who keep their joy of joie de vivre even in the midst of difficulties. His Holiness himself once gave a striking image about that. We were in Portugal, and he had seen a lot of construction work going on, and when he gave a public talk in the evening, he said, well, if you move for the first time as the new owner of a high-tech luxurious flat on the 100th floor of a skyscraper, but you are totally depressed and destroyed within, all you are going to look for is a window from which to jump. So that was a very striking contrast, but it is quite true. And and on top of that, since the outer condition, our control on this outer condition is quite limited, it's temporary, and it is often illusory. And on top of that, if we decide that this is the outer condition that must be so that I will be happy, we must remember that the universe is not a mail-order catalog for our desires. So if we were to follow some of the definitions of happiness, I think it's kind to say that happiness will be the complete fulfillment of all our desire in duration, quality, and quantity. So if that's your definition, yes, it is true. You just have to throw the idea of happiness in the garbage bin. That is never going to happen. So, but fortunately, in a way, since the way you experience things can override the outer conditions, however important they might be, then you can think, what are the inner conditions for genuine happiness? So then it's a matter of observation, of honest investigation. What are the mental states that make me feel the sense of flourishing? What are those who clearly undermined? We might feel that a burst of strong anger is justified, or even sometimes people will try to justify hatred. But nobody deep within feels sort of good and harmonious about feeling hatred. You might say that jealousy is part of life, and it will be boring without jealousy. But if we were saying, okay, let's have a weekend to cultivate jealousy, and at the end of the weekend, I promise it will be 50% higher, who will come? We know instinctively, although we say that's what makes a colorful life and all that, that somehow we'll be a little bit better off without that. When we are looking at the beautiful landscape on top of a mountain, we don't necessarily regret the feeling of intensity of an emergency room in a hospital or something. So there's clearly states of mind that contribute, that nurture that flourishing, and some which are destroying it. So we call that mental toxins, in the sense that they poison our happiness and that of others, because they induce us to act in certain ways. So hatred is one, but also obsession, arrogance, envy, and mental confusion for all different kinds of reasons. Those do not lead to a sense of flourishing. On the other hand, altruistic love, and all those I mentioned, compassion, sort of inner peace, sort of sense of inner freedom, and all those, the more we experience them, I mean, if we have a weekend to cultivate loving kindness and compassion, people feel more inspired. That's natural. So the question is, can then happiness in that understanding be cultivated as a skill? So first of all, yes, it is absolutely natural to feel those emotions. We have been equipped by evolution to have those strong emotions, even they are afflictive. They have a use. I mean, like jealousy is unpleasant, but it's meant to reinforce the cohesion of the couple and so forth. Anger to quickly overcome obstacles or threat or obstacles to what you want, and so forth. So they are natural to every human being. And there are even some people say that we should not touch them because that's what makes a unique personality, a colorful life, a rich life. And it will be so boring without any of those. And happiness would be sort of a bland, sort of annoying state. And Goethe wrote that 3 days of uninterrupted happiness will be so boring. It's always the same. And the same French intellectual says suffering is so wonderful because it changes all the time. It's so intense and colorful. There's a kind of excitement of this intensity of suffering. But honestly, again, nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, may I suffer? So they are part of human nature. But the thing, I think, which is at the heart of the Buddhist approach to that, is that there are many ways to be part of something. It could be intrinsically part of something, and then you could never get rid of it. It would be like trying to destroy part of yourself. Or if you take this bottle of water, I hope it's just H2O, but you could have medicinal plants in it, and then it will have medicinal effects. it could have cyanide in it, and then the conference will end as soon as I take a few drops of it. But neither the cyanide nor the medicinal plant has changed H2O. So they could be part of water. It will be poisonous water or curative water, but water as such didn't change. That's one example that the Dalai Lama often gives about that the basic nature of mind, of consciousness, that fundamental primary cognitive faculty that allows us to know everything, to have emotions, to perceive the outer world, to perceive our inner world through memories, imagination about the future, and so forth. All that is made possible by a basic component of basic cognition that is different from an inanimate object that has zero cognitive faculty. From Buddhist perspective, we call that the luminous aspect of mind. Not that it sort of radiates, glows in the dark, but the example is quite interesting because if you take a flashlight and it reveals the outer world, but if you shine the flashlight on a heap of garbage, it doesn't become dirty. If you shine it on the heap of gold, it doesn't become expensive or precious. It just allows to see that. So light is not modified by what it illuminates. So likewise, the Buddhist idea, which is also connected with the contemplative approach of the basic nature of mind, tell that the fundamental pure awareness that is behind every thought, behind every emotion, is not tainted by the mental construct and the content of the mind. So like this water, it can be purified. You can remove the cyanide, distillate the water, filter the water, do all kinds of things. So this aspect, the idea of that it is possible to transform the mental landscape, there's a potential for that, is at the heart of the notion of mind training and of seeing happiness as something that we can cultivate. Cultivate in the sense that, well, once we have identified that certain emotions, certain mental states are detrimental to happiness, can we find the right antidotes? If we do find that altruistic love and other such qualities of nourishing happiness, can we then enhance them? The whole purpose of so-called meditation and the Sanskrit words and Tibetan words that we translate as Buddhist translators as meditation, both signify to cultivate, to become familiar with. So familiar with a new way of being, with a new way of perceiving reality, like as interdependent, as impermanent, to become familiar with qualities that, or to cultivate qualities for which you have the potential, like loving kindness. We all have the potential for it, but maybe it's just like sort of developed. And to become familiar with the way your mind functions, and to become familiar with that pure awareness that is beneath all the mental constructs. So all that is part of a process of familiarization. So that's what the spiritual path is about. So then comes the whole host of techniques and methods to neutralize or to dissolve those mental toxins. And we can find all kinds of methods that somehow adapted to the different dispositions of mind. Just to give a quick example, there are direct antidotes because there are some mental states which are mutually incompatible with each other. You cannot, at the same moment, toward the same object or the same person wants to harm and wants to bring good. You can maybe do at 2 consecutive moments, in the same way that you cannot reach a hand to shake the hand in a friendly way and give a blow in the face of someone. You could do it in 2 gestures, not in 1. So it simply means that the more you would bring sort of feeling of benevolence within your mind, the less at every of these single moments there will be space for the wish to harm. So cultivating direct antidotes that neutralize afflictive mental state. There could be other ways, which is also like not to identify with those mental toxins. We often do so. If I am very anxious, somehow anxiety is all over my mind. I'm sort of one with anxiety. But the mind always has the faculty to observe itself. It's like It doesn't need a second mind. It's like we say that the flame of a candle illuminates everything else, but the flame doesn't need a second flame to illuminate itself. So the mind can know itself. So therefore, I can have the awareness of anxiety, the awareness of jealousy, the awareness of anger. Now, instead of being 100% anger, there is an opening that is the awareness of anger, because awareness of anger is not angry, it's just aware of. So the space of mindfulness can grow, and then slowly, without neither suppressing the anger or the anxiety, nor let it explode, that process may that it just vanishes away. Now, this is something that happens within few moments. It's dealing with instantaneous thoughts and emotion in skillful ways. But if you repeat that process again and again as those affliction arises, what happens? There's a twofold process. First of all, each time that you do that, you would have successfully dealt with that emotional episode, not again neither suppressing it nor letting it completely explode. But then by doing that again and again and let it melt away, you will gradually erode the very tendency for that to arise. I mean, the threshold will be higher, it will take more to make you anxious or angry, and it will come less and less often. Until a certain time where, say for hatred for instance, it becomes inconceivable that you would consciously, willingly wish to harm someone. And having spent years and years near great spiritual master like His Holiness Dalai Lama or Khyentse Moshe or others, I cannot fathom their degree of spiritual realization, but one thing I'm totally convinced, that His Holiness Dalai Lama, there is no way that deep within there will be the wish to harm someone. That is gone. And that's, in his mind, is the result of 50 years of hours of practicing compassion and so forth. So this is possible. So from that perspective, happiness conceived as a way of being becomes a skill, becomes something that is the result of cultivation. So that describes a part, and that's what Buddhism is about. The fundamental teaching of the Four Noble Truths is to first to recognize suffering at all levels, the obvious suffering that you feel now, the causes of suffering, that is those mental toxins, the even deeper cause of suffering, which is the basic ignorance of distorting reality, of solidifying reality as permanent, as being made of autonomous solid entities and so forth, that dysfunction and cause in the end those mental toxins. That we can identify those causes, that there is a way to remedy to those, and there is a path to achieve that through different methods. So in a sense, if you write a book on just suffering, it's not very appealing. So the main Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths, were about suffering. That's why we have those cliches about Buddhism is only interested about suffering, and it's a very pessimistic approach. But it's like to say that a doctor is a pessimistic guy because he only deals with sick patients. The whole point is precisely that he's a doctor because he has some idea how to cure them. And so in a way, at the end of suffering, of course, is genuine ultimate happiness. And from the Buddhist perspective, it corresponds to the final exhaustion of those mental toxins and the final exhaustion of mental confusion. So it's like there's no more shadows. So wisdom as now is the predominant state of mind. And that's in a way what enlightenment is, the union of wisdom and compassion. We say like it's like the two wings of a bird, and you need to develop them and cultivate them simultaneously. A bird doesn't learn first to fly with one wing and then with the other one. So we need the wisdom so that we don't solidify reality, and we need loving kindness and compassion for a very good reason, which is the pursuit of selfish happiness is bound to fail. It's a lose-lose situation. It makes yourself miserable, and you make others miserable. There are two quick reasons for that. One is that selfishness goes with a lot of rumination, which is constantly centered about me, which is a very unpleasant state of mind. And also, the second is it's at odds with reality, because it again sort of brings you as a sort of autonomous entity, and while reality is interdependent. What loving kindness and compassion, first of all, those are the most positive among all positive mental states. Even neuroscience now corroborates that. But also it is in harmony with reality, because love and compassion are based on the recognition that just as I don't want to suffer, no one wants deep within it wants to suffer. And we are all sort of interconnected. My happiness can only in a way be built through and with that of others. So it is attuned to reality, therefore it will be functional. So compassion is united with wisdom, which is the correct understanding of reality. So that's why we say that ultimate Buddhahood, which is the only true, genuine happiness, is the perfect union of wisdom and compassion. So that's a very short overview of the Buddhist path. Of course, each of those, the use of antidotes, the various understanding of those mechanisms could be, investigated much more in depth. But just like a simple overview of the Buddhist view of happiness.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ricard, for those wise and compassionate words. The first discussant will be Corey Keyes, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University. He is the author of numerous articles and the editor of many books, and a member of a MacArthur Foundation research network on successful midlife development and co-chair of the first summit of positive psychology. He's a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion here, where he's a core member of the multidisciplinary project on the pursuit of happiness, a 5-year project funded by the Templeton Foundation, and he participated in the 2007 National Academies of Science Keck Futures Initiative on the future of human health span, demography, evolution, medicine, and bioengineering. His research centers on illuminating the two continua model of population health and illness, showing how the absence of mental illness does not translate into the presence of mental health, and revealing that the biological and psychosocial causes of true health are often distinct processes from those now understood as the causes or risks for illness. And these works are being applied to a better understanding of resilience, prevention of mental illness, and informs the growing healthcare approach to predictive health. Dr. Keyes has pursued these issues and is working on governmental agencies in England, in Canada, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and with the World Health Organization, with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and here in Atlanta with the Centers for Disease Control. Professor Keyes.
Thank you, Bobby. Can you all hear me? Good. Well, I would like to start with some good news, and then because I'm a sociologist, and sometimes our job is to sort of provide you with some inconvenient truths, so to speak, that present the challenges that we face as a nation and how we're going to get and promote more flourishing, as Matthieu has talked about, in our population. And ultimately, the points I want to make will suggest that I believe there's a deep rapprochement between what we're learning about the role of meditation as a skill and how we need in our public health system to begin to learn and apply more of these lessons to actually promote good mental health in not only the US, but worldwide. So the good news goes something like this. The Health and Human Services Administration just told us last month that we received a grant. I'm just part of a team, but through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for a 5-year project. And there's a good deal of money behind it, and the project will involve creating a national agenda to promote more flourishing or mentally, emotional, and behavioral health in the population. But they actually cite the work and I had nothing to do with it, but they cite the work on flourishing, so I'll have to tell you a little bit about what that means, because that's been what I've been focusing on, trying to look at mental health as the presence of something good, not just merely the absence. And when we talk about flourishing, I'm borrowing deeply from Aristotle's translation of eudaimonia as a particular approach to a good life, where he championed functioning well in life before and instead of pursuing only pleasure, and made the argument that if you as individuals and citizens strive to function better in your lives as both private and public beings, true happiness, sustainable hedonic, good feeling will accompany your lives. I believe that deeply, and I've tried to translate those lessons into ways we measure good mental health. That is, you need to have a certain amount of the things we call good functioning in life, things like purpose in life, integration into society, a sense that your daily activities matter to the world around you, that you're making a contribution, a sense of autonomy, that you have the confidence to think and express your own ideas, a sense of acceptance of yourself, but also of other people who aren't like you. I mean, I could go on, and there's a list of 11 symptoms or signs of good functioning. Some of them have to do with your private life, and some of them have to do with your public life. But flourishing means more than just functioning well. You have to have high levels of those things, 6 of the 11, but you also have to feel good about life, happy, satisfied, or interested in life. What does it mean to flourish? Simply put, it means to feel good about a life in which you are functioning well. Now, we can measure that, and there's then some debates about happiness. And during this conference, I think you might get the impression that everyone has a different meaning of happiness. But when you boil it down scientifically, it fits in those two categories. There's a hedonic version that appeals to human emotion, pleasure, and it goes back to the ancient Greeks and Epicurus, who championed a life of simple pleasures. And Aristotle, who argued that, well, we like pleasure as Greeks, but that should not be our only end. Yes, we are pleasure-seeking creatures, but the ultimate end is to function well, to be virtuous, to be good people, to be good citizens. And we should strive to develop our capacities along those lines to function well in this life. And you will have lived a good life, trying to obtain those ideals. So here we are, talking about happiness and how far it goes back into ancient Greek philosophy and how it's been refracted in various religious traditions. And I'm happy to say today we've made the public health case, because we can measure this in kids and adults. And we have a special issue of the American Journal of Public Health coming out in December where we're showcasing the science along with CDC and SAMHSA scholars. And we have evidence now that over a 10-year period, if you promote more flourishing in the adult population and in kids, you can prevent mental illness. You don't have to accept the argument anymore that treatment is the only option, that we can only restore broken souls once they're depressed, right? We have all the tools and pills and whatnot. We can prevent it. There is an alternative. And we will spend the next 5 years trying to bring together all the various constituencies in this country who have an interest or say they have a passion for this to begin to work together on a public health level, state by state, to begin to try to say, here's what we can do to keep more people flourishing, kids and adults, and here's what we can do to promote it in those who don't have it. Well, I'm with you. This has been a long haul. For the same reason that Matthieu said, when you deal with these things, people don't want to believe there's an alternative to the medical approach. There is. And we now have the science. But here's the catch. We've spent the last 10 years making the case that if you do this, you can save on health care costs, medical visits, prescription drugs, missed days of work, in addition to preventing mental illness. And now they want us to do this. Tell me, Corey, how do we promote it? How do we promote it? You've made the case we want to be there. How do we promote it? And that's where I think the beauty and wisdom of Buddhism and the various religious traditions who have been working on this, I think, for centuries, need to get more involved with us scholars beyond just psychologists. We sociologists are interested in applying this to whole societies. And we need it. We need it more than ever. You want to know when the onset of most common mental disorders are? Between the ages of 15 and 24. Anxiety, mood disorders, or substance abuse. By the time our kids have had a chance to even start this life, they're looking out and saying, is this really worth it? And we can show the reason that happens is that from middle school to high school, we lose 10% of flourishing. Right then and there. What are we going to do to protect all that's good about our lives? Medicine doesn't have the answer, and don't look to them. We're starting to engage in those conversations. So here's where I thought this notion of interdiscipline, I want to tie this back together. I was going back over The Art of Happiness, because Matthieu had talked about in his title of his talk, Cultivating Inner Discipline. I think we need that more than ever as one of the approaches, I think, to test on a public health level, how are you going to keep more people flourishing, whatnot. But here's what, in The Art of Happiness, Howard Cutler concludes with His Holiness. The Dalai Lama has repeatedly emphasized that inner discipline is the basis of a spiritual life, and it's the fundamental method of achieving happiness. And for reasons, right, you've heard inner discipline involves combating negative states of mind, anger, hatred, greed, and cultivating positive states, kindness, compassion, and tolerance. What they're talking about, the founders of this country were talking about, and what we're measuring in flourishing goes back to that very notion and what Aristotle was saying and what the founding fathers of this country wanted us. Jefferson said this, happiness is the aim of life, but virtue is the foundation of happiness. What is he saying? Well, we can seek pleasure, and all Americans have the right now because you have freedoms and you can accumulate property and wealth. But only through the restraint of reason and virtue can we obtain it in a way that reconciles two meanings of happiness. The first is individual interest, which goes back to pleasure. That's about feeling good. We're really good at that. The lizard brain, the limbic system, is well wired to push you in that direction, right? But there's another meaning of happiness that goes back, and it's about the greater good. Now, you can misconstrue that sometimes, but the greater good means it's our job and responsibility that we have the rights to pursue our individual pleasures, that we should also develop restraints and reasons that apply to functioning well as a citizen and as an individual, doing good things, living a life with purpose, integrating into society, contributing, having the confidence to express ideas and opinions that really matter. That double meaning of happiness is very important, and that's what flourishing is, and I think that's why we need inner discipline. And I also think that there's a deep reproach, because I love Aristotle, and Aristotle is my favorite theorist. In fact, I don't quote many sociologists. They never had any interest in this. I don't know why. But as I've tried to study this and show that mental health is more than the absence, that it consists of feeling good and functioning well, and made the case that we need to go there, it's become obviously clear that the challenge is how are we going to learn to balance those two meanings. Greater good, individual interests. So the bad news is this. Well, it's not, you can think of bad news as an opportunity, as in a challenge. We have been doing a good job in this country pursuing individual pleasures, and Adam Smith said that this was the illusion that would drive this economy, and it has. GDP has been going up, and although it's stalled in the last year or two, it continues to go up. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Census Bureau announced that for the first time in the history of this country, levels of income inequality are at a record high. Never before in the history of this country has so much wealth been concentrated in so few hands, and the distance between the richest and the poorest, the greatest. And the poorest, those 90%, roughly speaking, who own less than half of the national wealth, that 10% that has over half of it, there's a lot of poor people who believe that the only way they're going to find their happiness is through the material pursuit. And we live now in a time where there is greater differences in distance and suspicion, and the discourse of our civil lives and our political lives have gotten so coarse that we need more than ever to cultivate this inner discipline. But we need to apply it and expect it of our institutions, which are just collections of people thinking through policy and practice. I would like to see more compassion cultivated in the way Congress goes about its deliberations, in the same way Buddhists expect each of us as individuals to do compassion. And we will find our way. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Corey. Our next commentator is Professor Michael Perry, who is Woodruff Professor of Law at the Emory Law School. He did his undergraduate work at Georgetown and majored in philosophy and minored in religion before studying law at Columbia and then serving as law clerk, first to U.S. District Judge Jack Weinstein, and a year later U.S. Circuit Judge Shirley Hofstetler, and began his academic career at Ohio State University, where he taught for many years, before moving to Northwestern University, and then on to become a distinguished chair of law at Wake Forest University before coming to Emory in 2003. He is the author of 12 books and over 75 articles. I won't read you the titles of his books because it wouldn't have any time for him to speak. But he is presently writing 2 books, one on the morality and law of international human rights, the other on the constitutional morality of the United States. Professor Perry specializes in 3 areas: the United States constitutional law and theory, with an emphasis on constitutional rights and the court's proper role; law, morality, and religion, with an emphasis on the proper role of religiously based morality in the law and politics in a liberal democracy; and human rights theory, with an emphasis on the morality and law of international human rights. Professor Perry.
Thanks very much, Dean Paul. I am honored and delighted to be with all of you this afternoon, both all of you up here and all of you out there. It's been a long day. This is the last scheduled presentation. I'll be brief, try to be brief. And indeed, John Whitty has instructed me and the other commentators to be brief, and only if I were perversely committed to the pursuit of unhappiness would I decline to do John's bidding. My brief comment takes the form of a few thoughts about happiness, living well, and human rights. We are told in the program for this event, today's event, that the Dalai Lama, quote, has widely stated that he believes the very purpose of life is to be happy. As my friend and colleague Philip Reynolds explained this morning, however, and as we have observed all during the day's proceedings, in the past people have meant, and today people mean, not one thing by happiness, but many different things. So many different things that we have good reason to be skeptical about whether using this term is productive in our various discourses. So if we are going to talk, as the Dalai Lama did, about the purpose of life, I feel more comfortable saying that the purpose of life is to live well. if there is an overarching object worthy of our pursuit, it is a life well lived. But we, many of us, disagree with one another about what living well consists in. A man I consider my mentor, though I never met him, is Thomas Merton, the Roman Catholic monk who 42 years ago this fall, in 1968, shortly before he died in an accident, met and conversed with the Dalai Lama. Merton said, "There is no contradiction between Buddhism and Christianity. I intend to become as good a Buddhist as I can," said Merton. Well, then, do Buddhism and Christianity agree about what living well consists in? Was that Merton's point? According to the Christian worldview, the universe is, speaking analogically, an ongoing act of love. The actor, God. God is love. And we human beings are, continuing to speak analogically, children of God, love, and sister, brother to one another. We live well, we achieve happiness in the sense of living well, to the extent we succeed in becoming persons who discern, existentially, if not also intellectually, that is, with our hearts, if not also with our minds, who discern one another as sisters, brothers, and live our lives accordingly. That is, who live lives in which our relationship to one another is one of selfless love, which Christians call agape. I understand that the Sanskrit term for wisdom that Buddhists have used is prajna, and the Sanskrit term for compassion that Buddhists have used is karuna. We may say, I think, that the discernment of the other as sister, brother is prajna, wisdom, and that the living accordingly is karuna, compassion. We can see how the worldview I have just sketched, barely, not merely coheres with, but yields what I have called the morality of human rights, according to which, in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all members of the human family have inherent dignity, and we should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, in the words of the Universal Declaration. As the acclaimed philosopher Charles Taylor has explained, and I'm quoting Taylor, the affirmation of universal human rights that characterizes modern liberal political culture represents an authentic development of the gospel. These thoughts lead me to two questions which I want to leave you with. The Christian worldview, you know or have noticed, is a worldview that affirms the existence of a transcendent reality, as distinct from the reality that is the object of natural scientific inquiry. One may wonder why, in the name of God, so to speak, we should affirm the existence of a transcendent reality, given what the great 20th century Catholic theologian Karl Rahner called the endless desert of God's silence. We may wonder, given the endless desert of God's silence, why we should affirm with Julian of Norwich that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Nonetheless, the Christian worldview is a worldview that affirms the existence of a transcendent reality. And now the two questions. First, is the worldview I have sketched here, in particular the account of living well I have sketched, plausible for one who does not affirm the existence of a transcendent reality? In this regard, I commend to you an essay by Frans de Waal that appears in the online edition of today's New York Times, an essay that's highly relevant to that question. De Waal, as many of you know, is Candler Professor of Psychology here at Emory and Director of the Living Links Center at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center up the road. So that's the first question. Is the worldview I have sketched here, in particular the account of living well I have sketched, plausible for one who does not affirm the existence of a transcendent reality? The second question, the final question, does Buddhism, like Christianity, affirm? Does Buddhism at least implicitly affirm the existence of a transcendent reality? Or is Buddhism's worldview, like de Waal's, a purely natural scientific worldview? Relatedly, is Buddhism more than a psychology joined with a technique or set of techniques? Thank you.
Do we have time for a question? Interact. Would you care to address each other? Perhaps you'll...
Yeah. So, yes, I think you pointed clearly one question. I think the live well is, when you speak of happiness, I think there's well-being without an hyphen, and if it was not overused, it refers to your deepest aspect of your being. That means every moment of your experience being well in your being, deep within. And so somehow it is a bit closer from that concept of living well than happiness, which is a very vague word. So, yes, the Dalai Lama often has been confronted with these kind of questions, and his main purpose is what can we contribute to society as Buddhists, society at large. When he spoke again today of secular ethics, and when you say secular ethics, people think it's something diminished, it's something dull, it's something deprived of all its substance. But perhaps because this word, instead we should use ethics or spiritual values which are fundamental and universal. The altruistic love is universal in all great spiritual tradition. There's no argument about that. And if we were all together to cultivate that and unite around that instead of the theological divisions, and then instead of being flags of division, there could be flag of reunion, the great traditions. So in that sense, he's always shy to state the different levels of the Buddhist view. He speaks of Buddhist science, which is the analysis of reality that everyone can accept. The mechanism of happiness and suffering, the relation with hatred and compassion, this is basically so universal. It's like a Japanese physicist to find a new type of particle. The particle doesn't become Japanese. It exists or it doesn't exist. So those kind of truth, that hatred and anger and jealousy will destroy your happiness and that of others, doesn't have, although it has been reflected upon and experienced for 2,500 years in the Buddhist world as a science of mind and a kind of specialty, you could say. If it is true, it's true for all. If it's not, if it's fake, also for the Buddhists themselves. So in that sense, he speaks of Buddhist science because it's a honest, rigorous appreciation of reality. Then he speaks of Buddhist philosophy, or Buddhist religion, and Buddhist practice. So usually when we push him a little bit too much, he says, well, that's Buddhist business, none of your business. But what he means by that is, of course, there's an extreme richness in Buddhism of considering various levels of reality. We speak of relative truth and absolute truth. We speak of all kinds of very complex levels that leads to Buddhahood. And transcendence in a way that has certainly not much to do with what we call the deluded ordinary perception of reality. We perceive reality as solid. We perceive things as being intrinsically pleasant and unpleasant, as being more or less permanent. I think this watch was mine yesterday, is still mine today, and all kinds of things like that that are somehow not attuned with reality. And so it is quite true that even the absolute truth is beyond concept, it is said. So there is a lot of very, very deep concept that is also something that can be internalized to direct experience. This is part of the spiritual path, to eventually being able to apprehend not through just mental construct, but to direct experience the sort of deluded nature of mind, we call the Buddha nature, that is in every sentient being, that is like a piece of gold that just needs to be polished, even it has been buried in the mud for a long time, and that's totally devoid of all those mental toxins. That is not something that can be purely apprehended by examples, by words, by concept, but still that can be a fully experienced as a direct realization. So all this we could refer to transcendence. There's obviously, of course, in the Buddhist worldview, perspective about the ultimate nature of consciousness. That certainly is not the prevailing view with science as a continuum, or as a primary phenomena, just as matter is a primary phenomena, that when you come to superstrings or elementary particles, why the question of Leibniz, where there is something rather than nothing, unless you bring a creator, basically you just acknowledge that the phenomenal world is there. So Buddhism makes the same reasoning about the nature of consciousness, that if you are honestly pursuing introspection, you come to pure awareness, you don't come to neurons or your brain that you cannot even feel. So to be honest, pure experience is a primary phenomena. Then Buddhism goes on to say there must be a continuum, and just as in matter, nothing can come ex nihilo or disappear into pure nothingness, likewise, the stream of consciousness cannot come from nowhere and disappear into nothing. So this is, of course, not Buddhist science in the sense that it is not common reality that anyone with can immediately observe, but it is still part of the spiritual path, and is still part of the experience that is possible. So then we come to rely on some what we call valid testimony, in the sense that there may be things that are not out of reach, but that you cannot directly, immediately experience by yourself because of the lack of training, the lack of wisdom, the lack of insight, and it's something that needs to be cultivated even further. But then how is a valid testimony? Is that, if someone who has gone to that journey and say, for instance, in physics, I cannot prove or disprove the existence of this new particle, but if 15 experienced physicists who have checked each other's work agree that it must be the case, then we say, okay, if all those guys have verified each other's findings and they sort of, it's probably the truth, and we accept that and we put that in school books. So likewise, if a number of great contemplatives or someone like the Buddha and his followers have experienced a certain level of what we call absolute truth, and on all other aspects of life, they have a flawless sort of conduct and speech and everything, then the sort of likelihood is that if they are irreproachable on all other aspects, why should they conspire to all lie on one particular point? And so then you may say, well, it's not something that I have to believe out of blind faith, but it's an indication that there's something that I could discover. And that's also why the Buddha said, never believe what I said, simply out of respect for me, but rediscover it by yourself. Nevertheless, those indications are like a precious map to a land where you have not been yet, but the map is now the way to go. So in that sense, even it's not directly accessible right now, the possibility is always there. So that's, in a way, the other aspect beyond Buddhist science, which has to do with Buddhist inner science, and then with Buddhist practice. And as the Lama says, that's Buddhist business.
Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.